So I named my presentation this big long mouthful without really thinking about it, but so what I'm going to be talking about today is market participation for environment and development, exploring farmer participation in food markets and payment for environmental service programs. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what I'm working on for my PhD research. So to give you a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about, I'll start just introducing the market participation and development intersection, and then give you a bit of background on the food and environmental service value chains that I've been looking at and why I thought it would be interesting to look at these together, because that might not be immediately obvious. And then I'll give you an introduction to the case study that I did in Costa Rica. And finally, I'm in the middle of my analysis now, so I don't have any hard and fast results to present to you today, but I will give you a little snapshot of some of my data and the interesting stories that I think I might be finding there and that I'm pursuing in my analysis to see what's there. So the agricultural sustainability piece, I think, is a pretty important part of the broader global sustainability piece for a number of reasons. Very simply, agricultural land is quite a significant proportion of the Earth's surface, about 40% according to the FAO, and that agricultural land is having to feed a growing population of people. And there's evidence in the literature that some of the practices that we're using are not that sustainable. And where the development thing comes in is that smaller scale farmers in developing countries are actually managing a fairly significant portion of this global farmland. And so why the interest in market participation? Well, promoting or facilitating participation in markets as a tool for rural development is something that is both supported by researchers and is also being fairly widely used in development practice as well. So it's something that's happening, so worth looking at, I think. So I decided to look at two market opportunities for producers. One is transformed food markets, and one is payments for environmental services programs. And I'll give you a quick overview of what each of those is in just a minute. But I wanted to explain to you why I put markets in quotes there, and it's because a lot of payments for environmental services transactions or PES transactions are not actually pure markets in a sort of pure market sense. So that's why I put that in quotes there. So to start talking about transformed food chains, I'll first show you a conventional food chain. So you have a producer, a farmer, who's producing something like fresh fruits and vegetables, and those fruits and vegetables get sold along a whole chain of intermediaries until they get to the consumer. So you might have wholesalers and processors and retailers, and at each one of those stages, there's an exchange of the agricultural goods in exchange for money. So money and agricultural goods change hands. So increasingly in a more globalized world, we're seeing more and more examples of what people, authors in the literature, are calling a transformed food chain, where multiple steps of those intermediate steps are done by a single intermediary. And the classic, or a really classic example of that is Walmart buying fresh fruits and vegetables from a producer and then doing all of the steps in between, the packaging and the processing and the exporting and the distribution and the retail, to get those fresh fruits and vegetables from the farmer to the consumer. In the case of payments for environmental services programs, or PES, which I'll probably talk about them throughout the presentation, you have an intermediary who is usually, most often an NGO or government, who, is mediating this transaction where the producer produces environmental services and receives payment for them from a consumer of those services, or just generally somebody who is interested in seeing those environmental services generated. So I started noticing that in both those cases, you have kind of a similar structure to the value chain going on. And so I started I started calling them coordinated value chains, where you have this quite powerful intermediary in the middle who is driving or controlling this value chain through processes such as contracting, quality standards, things like that. Between the producers, so in the cases that I was looking at, farmers and farmer organizations, selling their products through to what are generally spatially distanced consumers. And so obviously, I mean, these are quite different products, food and environmental services, and the nature of this intermediary is also quite different. In the case of food markets, it's usually a private firm, and in the case of the PES value chains, it's usually an NGO or government. But you still have this the case of this strong intermediary in the middle who's controlling the transaction, and I thought that was interesting. So one of the reasons why I thought it might be interesting to look at them together was that you have this structural similarity, and right now the initiatives that involve producers generally don't, that involve producers in trying to get them involved in these transformed food value chains and PES programs tend to be quite separate, and the research that's done on them tends to be quite separate too. But if there are useful similarities, there might be opportunities that we're missing for example, learning between researchers, learning between practitioners, and who knows, maybe even aligning policy and programs that are directed at producers. So that was sort of the motivation for thinking about them in the same piece. When you look at the literature, the PES literature and the transformed food market literature, you see a lot of the challenges that farmers face, and particularly smaller scale farmers in accessing these opportunities. There's a lot of similarities. So some of the similar challenges that we see are high transaction costs, minimum quantity requirements, the need to specialize in order to participate in these opportunities, an inability to control the price, so the producers are price takers, the need to adhere to strict quality standards, and often there are delayed payments. We also see some evidence of some similar outcomes between PES value chains and some of the transformed food value chains. So some of the similar outcomes that you see in the literature, opportunities to increase your income and or increased human, social, and physical capital, so non-monetary benefits, and decreased resilience, or more broadly, sort of decreased capacity to cope well with change. And on the environmental side, some of the common outcomes that I found were in both PES value chains and the food value chains, there's often intensification of the use of the farmland. Sometimes there's reduced biodiversity and environmental service generation, and there is often increased control of the way products are produced by the intermediary. So I decided to do a case study in Costa Rica and ended up looking at dairy markets and payment for environmental service programs in that country. So this shows you roughly how I was thinking about my fieldwork. So I put together a bunch of human and environmental system variables. These were inspired by a whole bunch of human environmental system literatures, primarily the livelihood capitals development literature, as well as environmental services and social ecological systems literatures on the conservation side. And then those variables, I refined them working with key informants in Costa Rica and also through focus groups with producers in Costa Rica as well. Collected data through a combination of surveys, interviews, and focus groups. And so collected data at the farm level, primarily through these interviews and surveys, but then also along the value chain as well, through speaking to key informants who could tell me a little bit more about how that value chain functioned, as well as some of the context factors that might be influencing some of the results that I would be seeing. So I spoke to farmers who were participating in more coordinated value chains, dairy value chains, as well as for controls, people who were selling into more local markets. And I talked to producers who were both involved and not involved in payments for environmental services programs. And I collected a combination of qualitative and quantitative data, and using both types of techniques to look at that. Here's where I worked. I worked in a dairying region of Costa Rica called San Carlos, which is just north of the capital, San Jose, in the province of Alajuela. And to give you a picture of what the dairy scene, I guess, looks like in Costa Rica, the two more coordinated value chains that people can sell into tend to be Dos Pinos and Sigma Alimentos. So Dos Pinos is particularly interesting, and I designate it there with a different color arrow because it's actually, so Dos Pinos behaves like a large processing company in that the company makes all sorts of dairy products, and they do distribution and export, but it's also a cooperative, a producer cooperative. So producers are members of Dos Pinos. Sigma is a more sort of conventional large company. It's a Mexican It's a very large Mexican food processing company that sources some of their dairy in Costa Rica. Some of the farmers were selling to much smaller, more local producers and distributors, and then some of the farmers were selling very locally in that they were selling cheese or milk produced on farm, either to local retailers or sometimes even directly to consumers. The PES program in Costa Rica is a government program that's run by a government department called FONAFIFO, which is the forestry department in the government. And the way it works is you have producers generating environmental services through 4 main modalities that I've listed there, and then usually with the help of an intermediary who's usually a private consultant or a forestry company. They sell the environmental services to FONAFIFO, who receives money for their program, or you could say, I guess, sells them to taxpayers and private companies and public companies. And they're also looking for markets for the environmental services more globally as well, but to my understanding, Paige may be able to clarify this, I don't think they're actually there yet. Preliminary results. So looking at my data, it looks like there are a lot of the same sort of similarities that I described earlier that you find in literature between the environmental service value chain and the dairy value chains in Costa Rica. So again, you have this strong intermediary who has a lot of control over the transaction that's taking place, a lot of control over the value chain, and a lot of the same sorts of challenges to participation that I described earlier. But there are also some interesting differences and stories that I'm sort of pursuing in my analysis to see what's there. So the first is that I'll touch on today is the motivation to participate. So when speaking to producers, the big motivation to participate in, I guess, a bigger value chain, a bigger dairy value chain in Costa Rica, so selling Dos Pinos or Sigma, the big reason that people did that was economic and access to sort of a bigger market, so ability to make more money. When asking people why they participated in the PES program, economic motivations were much less important. And one of the really interesting ones that came out fairly frequently was people said recognition was one of their main reasons to participate. So recognition as somebody who was an environmentally conscious individual. Another thing is I've found some evidence that there may be indirect environmental benefits to the Payments for Environmental Services program in Costa Rica. And so that's something that I'm pursuing. And the final is this whole idea of a cooperative intermediary. So having a company like Dos Pinos that in a lot of ways behaves like these big powerful intermediaries in other coordinated value chains, but is at the same time a producer cooperative. So I'm going to talk in my last couple minutes here, I'm going to talk just a tiny bit more about a couple of these. So the first is the idea of indirect environmental benefits of the Payments for Environmental Services program. So these really kind of crude graphs that I'm showing you now are just basically images of my data. So I haven't figured out whether these are significant yet. I haven't run them against any controls. These are just percentages of people who answered questions in certain ways, but just to give you an idea of why I think there might be a story here. So these first ones show whether or not people use different kinds of fertilizer, so animal fertilizer and chemical fertilizer. And it looks like people who participate in PES may be less likely to use fertilizers than people who don't participate in PES. And that's especially interesting because input use tends to be correlated to increased wealth. So when you have more money, you tend to use more inputs. And people who participate in PES tend to, on average, be wealthier than people who don't. So it's interesting that you have people who are participating in PES but who look like they might be using or less likely to use fertilizers than people who don't. And it also looks like participants in PES may be more likely to have part of their land fallow, more likely to plant trees in their pastures, that's even if they're not participating in agroforestry as part of the PES program. They may be more likely to actively protect watercourses on their farm, and they may be more likely to compost effluent from their milking area on their farm. So this is interesting if there are these additional environmental benefits that are not part of the PES program, and that for me kind of ties into producers listing one of their motivations to participate in PES as recognition, because recognition is somebody who is an environmentally conscious individual, because one of the, I guess, criticisms of PES in the literature is that it may decrease intrinsic motivations for conservation. Whereas this suggests that, well, in some programs this may not actually be the case. It may actually be reinforcing people's self-image and reinforcing people's other environmentally sound practices to sort of reinforce that image as an environmentally conscious individual. So that could be interesting. The other potentially interesting thing that I'll touch on here is this idea of cooperative intermediaries. So Dos Pinos being both a big processing company and a controlling intermediary, but also a cooperative. And so when I spoke to producers, I saw many similar benefits to what you find in the literature that are benefits to selling to these large buyers. So increased income, increased access to resources and markets, and better stability. So knowing that you're always going to have somebody to buy your product. And similarly, I saw the same sorts of criticisms that are often in the literature, the same sort of issues, in that producers can become locked in. And you can see that it looks like the larger producers selling into the larger value chains, so the cooperative, that's Dos Pinos, and other large buyers, were more likely to say that it was very difficult to change what markets they were selling into. But the flip side is that, so people who are selling to Dos Pinos also seem to have greater access to resources, which might actually help to counter this sort of locked-inness, I guess, and increase their ability to cope with change, because they generally had higher incomes and greater access to things like credit, inputs, information, and education. And the other thing that was interesting that really came out in the interviews was that people who were involved in Dos Pinos, they also felt like, even though on a day-to-day basis, they didn't have any more control than the people selling to Sigma in terms of, for example, they couldn't negotiate the price that they were being offered for their milk on a day-to-day basis in terms of their transactions. They still said that they felt like they had more control over the transaction because they had representation in this producer organization. And so they had people who would go and would meet with the other people who were involved in Dos Pinos. And so they felt like they had representation and ownership in that process, which I think could be important. And I'm also going to look at some indications of well-being too. One of the things that I did was I asked a standardized set of well-being questions as part of my survey. And it looks like it's possible, again, I still have to see whether this is significant or not, but it looks like people who are involved in the cooperative may just generally have more positive answers to these well-being questions than people who are just selling to big dairy companies like Sigma. So a few interesting stories there, but if you want to know what the actual story is, I guess you'll just have to stay tuned, because that's all I have for today. And thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions if you have them. Sarah. Okay, so the question is, to what extent are my findings specific to my case study, and to what extent are they generalizable? That was something that I thought a lot about when I was setting up my study. And so I didn't talk about it here because it just kind of complicated things, but I did also go to Mexico as well and did participated in a couple of focus groups with another project that was being run by a researcher who I was connected to in Costa Rica on similar issues. And I will be getting some data from that project. The project wasn't as awesome as I was kind of hoping to from the outset, so I don't think I'll be able to do anything really strong with it, but it should be enough, I'm hoping, to help give me a sense of how context is influencing those different situations, and I hope at least say a little bit more about exactly that, to what extent the results seem to be context specific and to what extent they don't seem to apply. So I'm hoping to say something about that, but I'll see, how that turns out. Yeah. Yes. why am I doing it? Well, because, okay, so why am I comparing food markets and environmental service programs? I guess, so what interested me is that in both cases, and I probably, again, for the sake of time, I probably didn't dive into this quite as much as I should have, but in both cases, so you have this really strong intermediary. In the case of the environmental service transaction, it's the government usually, or an NGO or something like this. And it's the same kind of, from the producer's perspective especially, it's a similar sort of transaction in that you have the intermediary basically dictating the terms of the relationship, basically saying, if you do this in this way, in this time span, I will give you this amount of money. There's no room to negotiate. There isn't, like, it's very determined by the intermediary. And that type of relationship, looking at the literature, seems to generate similar sorts of challenges to producers who maybe want to get involved in that transaction. And a lot of those challenges seem to be similar to the kinds of challenges that producers face getting involved in these more coordinated value chains for food as well. Again, you get a big company or something saying like, okay, you can sell milk to me if it's this quality, if you have this much on this day, kind of thing. And so there are certain things that you might be able to do to improve the ability of producers to access that opportunity, I guess, to potentially generate more money, to access bigger markets, that sort of thing. And so my thinking was, if those similarities are in fact useful, there may be ways to, for example, take problem solving about how to increase access to that opportunity from people working in PES and apply some of those methods, I guess, or problem solving methods to a transformed food market opportunity and vice versa, for example. So I don't know if that'll actually be the case, but that's sort of where my thinking was going when I started thinking about them together. Yeah. Yeah, Gerald? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's, again, it's not across the board, right? And all programs are quite different, and those aren't sort of universal, like if you're involved in PES, this is what will happen, but there are cases where, and I think this is probably, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's probably more common in carbon markets, where you get this really strong focus on a single environmental service. And so what can happen in some carbon markets if they're not if the programs aren't put together well, is you get people going in and just planting monocultures just to generate carbon, because that's the best tree to generate carbon quickly or something like that. But yeah, it's more of a program design thing, but yeah, it does seem to happen. Yeah. Okay, thank you.